This is The Reality. And a special hello to you. Welcome indeed to The Reality. My name's Dudley Anderson, and it's really my pleasure to be with you again, sharing the story of a life touched and changed for the good, for good. If you have a story to tell of what God has done in your life, I would love to hear from you. Do drop me an email, dudley@showreality.net. Today on The Reality, we meet John Lawson. John suffered the breakup of his parents' marriage at an early age. His mother was forced to move into a house in one of the most dire council estates in Glasgow, Scotland. Here, John learned to protect himself by adopting a violent lifestyle. Soon, he found himself engrossed in a life of organised crime. Money was his god. Subsequently, John ended up in prison, serving a 5.5-year sentence for extortion. However, the persistence of a Nigerian friend in prison led John to experience an encounter with the living God.
That night when I was locked in my cell, I decided to open the Bible. I actually opened it up in the book of Ezekiel, and it was the very first thing I ever read in the Bible. It's from Ezekiel 18:27-32 that says, "Again, if a wicked man turns away from the wickedness which he's committed, and if he does what is just and right, he will live." I knew I was a wicked man. So the following Thursday, I went back to the Bible study to ask this pastor, how is this possible that God can give a man a new heart and a new spirit?
This is John Lawson's story.
I was born in Glasgow in Scotland. When I was 3, we emigrated to South Africa. I was raised in Durban to the age of 10. My father was a policeman in the Durban City Police. My mum had a nice job in a nice shop, and life was vastly improved from the poverty of Glasgow in the 60s. And life seemed to be going well. But when I was 10, my mum had to quickly return to the UK because my grandfather was terminal with cancer, had a few weeks to live. And so a decision was made. My mum, my little brother, who was a baby, came back here, and they were going to stay till after the funeral. I stayed in South Africa with my dad. I was still at school. And we were approaching the long holidays, and my dad picked me up from school. We broke up a day early. When we got back to our apartment, though, my dad said to me that he had to lock me inside. He had to go to work, and he may not make it home that night, and I should just look after myself. What we didn't realize is my dad was having an affair with another woman, and he decided to go off and have a holiday with her and leave me alone in the apartment. He didn't even leave any food out, which was just ridiculous. And, at that time of year, it's the hot summer. It's very humid in Durban. And I waited for my dad to come home that night, and he didn't come home. In fact, 4 days later, I was found drifting in and out of consciousness on the living room floor when some family friends broke open the front door. I hadn't eaten or drunk anything for about 4 days. And for a 10-year-old, that's just not a good place to be.
Wow.
My next memories are being put on an aeroplane by myself and brought back to the UK, where I joined my mum, who was in shock that my father had told her, don't bother coming back to South Africa. Our whole life was there in South Africa. My mum was staying in our grandparents' house with another one of her sisters and her kids, so it was very overcrowded, and I felt like an alien in my own home country. I just did not feel British at all. I wasn't used to the swear words from the other kids at school, the disrespect. It was just, it was a big change. My grandfather died fairly quickly. My grandmother got very sick after that, and she died within a couple of months. And so my mum had lost her husband, her home, both parents, all within a matter of months, and we were now homeless. So it was a massive change to the whole family structure. We then found a place to live in Scotland. We didn't have any money, so we were forced to go and live on a housing estate called Drumchapel, which at the time was known as the most notorious place to live in the whole of Europe. And I was really shocked on my first day there, playing out in the street, when an older boy came along and opened his jacket, and inside his jacket he had a hatchet, an axe, and I said to him in my little South African accent, "Oh, what are you going to do with this axe? Are you going to chop some wood?" And he said to me, "I'm going to chop your head off."
Oh my!
And I just ran upstairs, and I called my mummy, and these kids just didn't. It was like, "Ma, hey Ma," and so I stood out like a sore thumb. First day at school, I got into fights with. I was so polite. I'd never been in a fight before in South Africa. I was really keen on my rugby. I was a sportsman, a sports boy, and I just was picked on, put against the wall, and told in some nasty words that again I was going to get my head kicked in, and would I like to have a fight after school. I was so polite. I just agreed to have a fight, and somehow I managed to win the fight. I landed a lucky punch, and this boy had punched me in the head so many times, I discovered an ability to be able to take a punch without falling down. And the next day in school, everybody wanted to be my friend. So I quickly put two and two together on that housing estate. You weren't popular because you were into sports or by how kind or nice you were or your family. People respected violence by how hard you were. And that really was a shift in my mentality. I got heavily into martial arts, and I used violence then as a means to just express my anger. I became an angry young kid. I really hated the police. Remember, my father was a policeman, and on that estate, a lot of drunken men would beat their wives up, and the police would do nothing. In those days, they called it a domestic, and it was between a husband and a wife. And my mum would often open our flat and as a refuge for these women who would come in with broken noses and blood all over their faces, and the police would come and do nothing. And it just angered me. I wanted some form of justice. When I left school a few years later, by now we'd moved back down to the north of England, and we were living in a place called Birkenhead, which is near Liverpool. And I went to an all-boys school. It was a rugby school, which I was very pleased with, and I excelled in rugby, but I was also had a violent mentality now. I would get into fights at school. And the only thing that saved me were the sports teachers from being expelled, because they always wanted me in the first 15 in each year. And that's the only reason I think I stayed in school. But as a young lad with no father to guide me, I would be out doing stupid things, Dudley, breaking into factories, shoplifting, stealing what I could, because I just wanted money. I believe money. And I wanted to help my mum as well. I wanted to give her money, and my mentality was all wrong. When I left school, I was drawn down to Soho in London. My uncles had got connected with the Maltese mafia, who were predominantly running the sex industry in Soho in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s. It's mostly Eastern Europeans today. But they had got connected through prison with these Maltese mafia, and they had become, I suppose, in that industry very successful, very rich, making lots of money, running peep shows. And my uncles were making 40, 50,000 pounds a week from these places, and they had hostess bars and adult pornographic shops. I mean, anything to do with pornography and the sex industry, my uncles were into it. And I went down to work with my uncles. I made a lot of money, maybe 10, 15 times more money than my friends back home were making, working in factories. But this would lead to my first time in prison, where an American tourist didn't want to pay his very extortionate bill, and I kung fu kicked him in the chest and forced him to pay, and he ran into the arms of the police. I was sentenced to 9 months in prison, and it did nothing for me but turned me into a bigger criminal, really. When I got out of prison, I had to go back up north to let the heat die down, and I was only good at fighting, and so I became a bouncer, working in nightclubs all over the northwest of England. I worked with a team of men who were predominantly ex-Special Forces soldiers, and we were a very tight unit. I was very confrontational. I had a lot of blood on my hands, really, I'm ashamed to say. And our company began to use us then to go to nightclubs all over the northwest of England, where the local bouncers had lost control. of the situation and maybe intimidated by local gangsters. And how you deal with that situation is you bring in a gang of experienced men who are not going to be intimidated by reputation. And then you clean the place up. And, cleaning the place up inevitably escalates violence. And then you bring in a new team and you move on to the next place. So the level of violence was climbing in increments. I thrived off of it. And at the same time, I led a double life because I was a family man. I was married and had kids. But by now I was getting into quite serious crime as well. For just to make a little bit of extra money, my friends and I would begin to rob drug dealers. We found them an easy target. We kind of felt we were doing society a favor. At least that was my excuse to get into kidnap and extortion. And it just began the cycle of robbing drug dealers, or they nickname it in areas like Manchester, taxing drug dealers, because a drug dealer can't go to the police. So it was a win-win situation for us. And again, the violence had escalated, and now we were committing a lot of violent crime with shotguns and holding men hostage and robbing them. It was just ridiculous, really, Dudley. I needed an outlet for all of my anger, really. I trained as a bodyguard to kind of really revitalize my career, so to speak. I began to work with some really famous people. For a short time, I worked with the Rolling Stones when they came to visit Edinburgh, and I would boast to all my friends about how me and Mick Jagger were best mates. But really, I probably had one conversation with them the whole time I was there. It turned out to be the most boring job I ever had. Sitting in a hotel corridor outside Keith Richards' room for 12 hours on a night shift, staring at a door for 12 hours and maybe seeing him in the morning with a quick hello, and that would be it. No one to talk to, stuck in a 4-foot corridor all night. And it wasn't as glamorous as I made it out to be. But by now we were moving in circles where there was a lot of money. And again, I'm just giving you the highlights here for the sake of time. It was a very violent affair. But the circles we were moving in, there was a lot of money. I went to prison again for a second time, working for my uncles in that prison. And it was only a short 9-month sentence. But in that prison, I made some connections with some guys who were involved in what they call the carousel fraud, where they set up false companies here and in Europe, and then they invoice the government for VAT for £1 million worth of goods, which they haven't spent. They would get £175,000 back from the government on each deal they did, and they were doing 10 or 15 deals a month.
Gosh.
And these guys were, driving around in Bentleys and Porsches and Ferraris, and inevitably they would rob each other and rip each other off. When those kind of people have a problem with money, they need a professional team. They can't go to traditional debt collectors, of course. And so now these people would come to men like us to go and chase their debts and collect all the money for a large commission. And so one of the first guys had stolen £13 million from our client. He wanted his money back, of course. We sent a team. There was 4 of us. We went over to Spain to track this guy down, and we stood to earn about 1.3 million in commission. It was very lucrative, and we went over to Spain, and we decided we'd have to kill this guy, really, because he had enough resources to come after us. Fortunately for him, on the day that we planned to take him down and kill him, all of his family turned up for a holiday, and we were sitting outside dressed as police officers with weapons and stun guns ready to go in and take this guy down. We had to call the job off and go back at a later time. Well, back in the UK, we began to get into more robberies, taking people down, robbing drug dealers, holding men hostage. My whole world now had become embroiled in kidnap and extortion and shotguns. It was a crazy mentality. And like I say, I convinced myself I was a good guy.
You're listening to The Reality, produced by Sure Reality, a listener-supported radio ministry. We depend on the generous gifts of our listeners to produce this program. you can help reach millions of folks with the sure reality of the message of Jesus by becoming a Sure Reality Vision Partner. To partner with us, please visit the website surereality.net and click on Become a Vision Partner.
If you've just clicked on in or tuned in, it's really good to have your company. My name's Dudley Anderson, and you are listening to The Reality. If you've heard anything thus far in our program that has raised a question in your heart, I'd love to answer that question. Please drop me an email, dudley@surereality.net. If you have any comments or questions, email me, dudley@surereality.net. Well, today on The Reality, we've been speaking to John Lawson. We've heard how John and his family moved to South Africa from Britain when he was a baby. Sadly, however, after his parents split up, his mother returned to Britain with John and his brother. They moved into a very dire council estate near Glasgow, where John learned to defend himself by becoming violent. When he grew up, John entered the world of organised crime. His life of crime grew until, as a trained, hardened bouncer and bodyguard, he eventually joined a gang to collect debt from fraudsters. John Lawson was a violent professional criminal and extortionist who believed that he was the good guy. He was making lots and lots of money until he was finally tracked down by the law and sentenced to 5.5 years in prison for attempted extortion. It was in prison that John Lawson's life was changed for the good, by the reality of Christ. Let's continue listening to John Lawson's story today on The Reality.
I began to realize that my actions really now, for the first time, had an impact on my family, because my wife and kids had to go into temporary accommodation and the house had to get sold, and I was all over the newspapers, and it was very embarrassing for my wife, who had no idea of the level of crime that I was involved in. And it was just a crazy time. So it didn't take long before she wanted out of the marriage, and we got divorced, and my attitude was fine. I'll get out of prison. I'll get straight back to it, and it won't take me long to get all my money back, and I'll find someone new anyway. But in prison, I made friends with a Nigerian guy who happened to be a Christian, and that was the one aspect of him that I didn't like very much. But this Nigerian prisoner, he always had a smile on his face. He was always very kind, didn't want anything from you. But like I say, I didn't like the fact that he kept talking about Jesus and God, and I gave him a hard time about that. And he just would smile and say, look, I made mistakes on the outside. But every Thursday, there was a pastor who came in from a local village to do a Bible study with the prisoners. And every Thursday, this Nigerian would invite me in the prison yard to go to the Bible study, and every Thursday I refused. Until one Thursday, he explained to me, he shared with me, Dudley, something very important. He said, you know, this pastor who comes into the prison, did you know he brings with him nice cake and coffee and biscuits? Oh, I said, why didn't you tell me that before, you idiot?
Yes.
So I changed my mind, and I decided to go to the Bible study so I could get my hands on all the goodies. And I was so disappointed when I got there, because there was a table with sachets of coffee and biscuits and cakes, and the pastor moved us all over to the other side of the room and said that we're going to have a bit of singing and Bible study first before we have the biscuits. And I was just disappointed, and I thought, I don't need this. What's all this singing? What are they going to do? Start singing hallelujahs and kumbayas or something? Well, there was 12 other prisoners there that night. Murderers and drug dealers and bank robbers and a violent animal like me. And the pastor handed out these laminated song sheets and pulled out a guitar, and I was thinking, oh, here we go. But you know, these men, they just look so relaxed and happy in this environment, and in prison you've got nothing to be happy about. And they began to raise their voices and raise their hands and lean back on their chairs, and they just began to sing with all their heart, without care. And it just really touched me in that moment. I was looking at the words on the song sheet, and as I was looking at these words, it was a song I'll never forget. It was called Open the Eyes of My Heart, Lord. And I couldn't believe it, really, because my heart began to stir. I knew I was going to cry, really. You know that kind of crying, Dudley, that starts off in your stomach and rises in your chest, and you don't know where it's come from. And well, I hid my face behind the song sheet because I didn't want them to see me crying. You don't want guys to see you crying in prison. And Well, I cried like a baby, really. And I can't tell you much more about that night because I don't really remember. I just remember being back in my cell and having a bit of an uncomfortable sleep. And I was wondering what the heck was going on. And the next morning, Friday morning, the guards unlocked my door, my cell door, and there was a Nigerian standing there with a Bible behind his back, and he attempted to give it to me, and I refused. I looked at that Bible, and I said, I don't want that rubbish, thank you very much. Well, for the first time, really, the smile left his face, and he stared me right in the eye, and with his finger, he poked it on this Bible, and he said, let me tell you, this so-called rubbish is the very same thing which changed this rubbish talking to you. And there was just something in his words and the conviction in his heart that I said, okay, give it to me. And I threw it on my bed, and that night when I was locked in my cell, I decided to open the Bible. I actually opened it up in the book of Ezekiel, and it was the very first thing I ever read in the Bible. It's actually, it's where I get the title for my book. My testimony has been written in the form of a book, and my book is called If a Wicked Man. And people say to me, why is your book called If a Wicked Man? Well, it's from the very first thing that I read in the Bible. I'd like to share it with you if that's okay. It's from Ezekiel 18, 27 to 32, that says, again, if a wicked man turns away from the wickedness which he's committed, and if he does what is just and right, he will live, because he considers all of the offenses he's committed and he turns away from them. He will live and he will not die. And yet the house of Israel says, oh, the ways of the Lord are not just. And God says, no, is it not your ways that are unjust? Therefore, I will judge each one of you according to your ways, declares the sovereign Lord. So repent and turn away from all your sins, so that your iniquity will not be your ruin. Cast away from you all the transgressions which you've committed, and I will give you a new heart and a new spirit. For I take no pleasure in the death of anyone, declares the sovereign Lord. Therefore repent and live. Well, I don't know what those words might mean to some of your listeners, maybe nothing, but in that prison cell, I knew that I was this wicked man, and I had this desire for a new heart and a new spirit, but I didn't know how to get it. I knew I needed it because I was plotting murder, and I had all these sins that I'd committed, and I knew I was a wicked man. So the following Thursday, I went back to the Bible study, not to steal anything, but to ask this pastor, how is this possible that God can give a man a new heart and a new spirit? And he shared the gospel with me, Dudley, in a very simple way, a way that was very relevant to my situation, being in prison. He talked about court and law and justice and mercy and grace as well. And he shared it with me in such a simple way. He said, you know, John, you committed crimes and you stood before a judge in court, and the judge found you guilty and you were sentenced to prison. But one day when you die, you're going to stand before God on Judgment Day. And on that day, do you think you'll be guilty or innocent, heaven or hell? It was as simple as that, really. And I tried to argue my case. I said, well, you know, I've done a lot of good things as well. I've given money to charity. And when I was on bail, I rescued 9 people from a burning building, and I was awarded medals from the police and fire brigade. And, you know, I help little old ladies across the road. I love my family. And, you know, I've done lots of good things. And he said, well, John, when you were in court and you told the judge that you rescued people from a building, did he just let you off with the crimes you committed? I said, no, he didn't, unfortunately. He still sentenced me to prison. And he said, well, in the same way, you can't bribe God with your good works. You're not on trial for the good things you've done, but for the bad things that you've done. Then he said to me, do you know what God did for guilty sinners like you and I, so that we would not have to go to hell? I said, no, tell me. I really had no idea. He said, well, he sent his son, Jesus Christ, to this world, who lived a perfect life like no one else. And he died a very cruel and painful death on the cross to pay the fine that you could not pay. And I said, what do you mean, the fine I couldn't pay? He said, well, imagine you were back in court And the judge said, John, I've got to send you to prison or you pay £1 million fine. And you say, well, I don't have £1 million. But some rich guy stands up and he writes a check. He pays your fine. The judge could do what is legal and just. He could set you free. You wouldn't have to go to prison because your fine was paid. And in the same way, when Jesus went to the cross, it was like he wrote a check for your life with his blood. And miraculously, after 3 days, the check cleared because Jesus rose from the dead and he's alive today. And he said, are you aware of the legal implications? I said, what legal implications? He said, God can legally dismiss the case against you because Jesus Christ paid your fine. And all you have to do to receive this free gift is just be willing to repent and then surrender your life to him. And while I thought about these things in that prison, and it was about a week later, I kept going over in my mind these two things, as Pastor said, repent and surrender your life to Christ. And that was the first time I cried out to God, really, Dudley, in my prison cell. And I called out to God, and I must have been there for hours, really, on my knees, crying. And then I surrendered my life to him. And in that prison, he really did set me free. I felt like a free man, even though I was behind bars.
Jesus.
Well, I left prison, like I say, in 2007, and I joined a local church. I got baptized, which was just incredible. And my life changed completely. Jesus rebuilt my life. I left prison with no possessions, homeless. And all these years later, my life is vastly different to how it was then. I went into full-time Christian missionary work, faith-based, no job, no income. The Lord has supplied for me for the last 16 years. I have spoken in some of the most violent prisons in the world, and prisons like in Guatemala and French Guyana to Australia and New Zealand and all over the world.
Wonderful.
I get invited to speak in Bible colleges and schools and churches and events. It's just incredible. Today, I've been married to Carolyn, a lovely Christian girl, for over 12 years now. I have a home and a family, and the Lord has just rebuilt my life and supplied my every need.
You've been listening to a chat with John Lawson today on The Reality. If John has said anything that has just struck a chord in your heart, perhaps you're looking for that freedom, that liberty that John experienced as he gave his life to Jesus, I encourage you to simply open up your heart and say, Dear Jesus, I'm sorry for my sin, and I ask you to come into my life as I give my life to you. Pray that with all earnestness, and I believe that God will change your life. For more information, do write me an email, dudley@surereality.net. Any questions, email me, dudley@surereality.net. The Reality is produced by Sure Reality, a listener-supported radio ministry. Please find out more at surereality.net. From me to you, as always, keep walking in the sure reality of Christ.